Hi, in this video, we'll go over how to configure the recommended EDU device configuration settings for Windows 10 and 11 devices using Microsoft Intune. And so when you're at the GitHub repo that has the EDU device configuration settings, you'll see in here that we describe what the goal is of this project, which is to provide an easy way for EDU IT admins to configure their devices set up based on Microsoft recommended best practice settings for a few different use cases. Number one, the one-to-one device configurations for faculty and student devices. Number two, student user configurations, which is slightly different than the one-to-one device configuration settings. The student user configuration settings is really designed for protecting the students and preventing them from installing things that they shouldn't be installing directly from the internet. And so those settings would be targeted to a user, whereas the one-to-one device settings are obviously targeted to a device group. And lastly, we have shared cart, lab, and kiosk configuration settings. And so these settings are obviously for your shared devices that are within the organization. Now what we know is that these settings are not all inclusive. What we mean by that is we know we're going to be missing something. And if things are missing, we do want the community to submit feedback. And you can do that through this GitHub repo by either clicking the open an issue or submitting a pull request. And we'll evaluate the settings that you'd like to add to the repository, and we'll add them if they make sense. Now, once you do this and you import all of the settings, what you'll end up with is a number of profiles that are configured in the tenant. So you'll see that we have configuration profiles, and within configuration profiles, you'll see that there are a number of different policy types. So you'll see that we have software updates, settings catalog, Windows health monitoring, and various custom settings as well. What you'll also notice, though, is as we go through the different types of things that get imported, you'll also notice that we have Win32 applications. We have update rings, we have endpoint security, antivirus, and endpoint security disk encryption. And then lastly, we'll have autopilot profiles, and there's one thing that's not shown here, but we also include some filters that you can use for a couple of different profile types. Now, in order to import all of this stuff, there is a tool that we use that's a community tool that allows you to import and export policies in and out of your tenant. And so what we're going to be doing is just importing into a tenant. We're not going to be exporting anything out because we provide you with a zip file that contains all of the settings that you need. So if you're curious about what this tool is the Intune Management PowerShell script from Mick, or Mickey, I don't know how to say his name. However, if you go to this link here that says read the documentation, this will explain exactly how the tool works. It's not a tool that's provided by Microsoft, it is a third-party community tool, and it seems to work very well. We have not had any problems using it, so go ahead and click on the documentation if you're curious about more of the functionality or how the tool works. You can look at all the code, it's all open source. So what we're going to be doing is we're going to download that tool, the Intune Management PowerShell script, from that repository. And then we will also download the Microsoft EDU recommended Intune configuration zip file. And we'll extract both of these. So let's go ahead and click on this first link here. And this should download. And once it's been downloaded, we'll want to open it and extract its contents. So let's go ahead and open the file. And then we'll just copy this. And I'll put it in a folder called Intune. And then we will do the same thing for the zip file. And this zip file is a collection of JSON files that have all of the different settings for the different things that we're going to be importing. So we'll want to open this file as well. And then just copy this out and put it in the same folder. Okay. Now for step 3, we will want to open up there's a start CMD file that is inside of the Intune Management Master. If you open this folder up, there's this start CMD. You'll want to go ahead and double click on that. And when you run this, a command window should open that's going to call PowerShell. And once that opens up, you will see the tool. Now at the top right, there is a sign in button. Now I've signed in before with a number of different tenants. And so here I'm going to sign in with a different account. So we'll select this account here and type in our password. Okay, so we're signed in. However, because I've signed in to this tool before and I have consented to the permissions, you will have a different experience. Your experience will actually show that on the left-hand side, you'll see a bunch of things that are red. And that means that you haven't consented to the Intune PowerShell enterprise application within Enter ID to allow for the appropriate permissions that are needed. So when you go through this process, you'll have an option in here to like consent for permissions, or actually there should even just be a big prompt that comes up to ask you to consent for permissions. And you'll want to just consent for your own account. Don't consent on behalf of your organization. Make sure that you're consenting just for yourself. So that way you're the only one that has the ability to make any changes here. Once you do that and you've consented to those permissions, you might still see everything red and you won't be able to do anything. What you'll want to do is actually sign out. So when you click up here at the top, you can sign out and then sign back in, and that will refresh your token, and you should have the appropriate permissions to start to import things. So once you're back into the tool and everything over here, or at least most things over here, should show up as how you see them for me. You might have a couple things that are red still, because you might not have complete permissions for maybe some things like an Enter ID. It's generally going to be fine if you don't have everything all unread or all gray or red, black and gray like you see on my screen here. So what we want to do next is, according to the documentation, the docs should show our instructions here. Will say that you want to sign in. You may need to close and reopen Start CMD like I mentioned earlier. But then what we want to do next is hit bulk import. So if we go back to our tool, click on bulk, and we want to go to import. Now what should happen here is it should find the folder. Well, actually I take that back. It won't find your folder because I've been doing this before. So in my environment, it's detected that we've been using a separate folder. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go and browse to our C Intune folder. And in here, I'm going to take the MSFT edu recommended Intune configuration v3. This is that zip file that you had exported, or I'm sorry, that you had extracted. And we're going to import this. So we'll select this folder. So you should see C Intune and wherever you extracted these files to. And then you can just import. You can just click the import button and it should just take everything as is. If you're a little unsure and you want to make sure that we're not importing assignments, and assignments in Intune are how we target policies and target apps and various things in Intune to a device or a user group. If you're not comfortable and you don't think that the assignments are something you want to target, then that's fine. We don't have any assignments in any of the JSON, so you shouldn't have to worry about that. But if you're unsure, you can always just uncheck. So I'm going to keep it checked, just to keep this all at default. What you can also do is you can specify which objects you want to import. So if you want to test this out and you wanted to just do one type, you could uncheck this option here and then just specify maybe you only wanted the applications. It's completely up to you. But I'm just going to go ahead and import everything as is. So we'll click on import. Now this will take a little bit. The reason it's going to take a little while is because for the import applications, there are two Intune WIN files that we upload. And so an Intune WIN file is just the compressed content of the applications that we're uploading. So in this case, the applications we're uploading are actually just PowerShell scripts. So they're not huge. But if you were to import an actual like Win32 application, like something like Adobe Reader or something like that, that will take some time to upload because the content is just going to be so big. So the content and all the JSONs for everything have successfully uploaded. And so what we should see now in the tenant is we should see under configuration profiles, for instance, you should see that all of the policy types have been uploaded. And so now let's go back to our documentation and continue where we left off. So we've got our bulk import, and then it just walks you through here the different things that you need to do, and we've already done this. We do call out that the names of the configuration profile types are prefixed with either MSFT edu device or MSFT edu student. And if you're targeting devices, that means that we want to target a device group, and if you're targeting students, then we want to target a student group. Now, most of the things that are being imported are going to be prefixed with device. There's only a few things, maybe just actually two, that are targeted student. And the student stuff is primarily just to prevent them from running things. So like I mentioned earlier, to prevent them from installing applications, but also to prevent them from running PowerShell, command prompt, and various other Windows administrative tools. What we've also done is we've included two additional configuration profile types for removing widgets in Windows 11, and then also removing news and interests for Windows 10. Now, both of these are two different things. They might seem like they're the same thing within Windows because they both show news and other consumer types of things, but we want to make sure that these are removed correctly based on the platform type. And so how you remove these, you can either target these to a group of Windows 11 devices. If it's widgets, then you would target to a group of Windows 11 devices, or you can target to a group of Windows 10 and 11 devices, but then also use the Microsoft EDU All Windows 11 Devices filter. So the two filters that we're providing you are designed to be used with these two profiles. So if you want to remove widgets, then what you should be doing is, like it says, either target this widgets profile to the Windows 11 group of devices that you have, or target it to a combined group of devices that contain Windows 10 and 11 devices, and then leverage the filter. We'll go through this in the demo as we get through the console. But there are also some additional items that need to be configured. There is a Microsoft EDU device general configuration settings customize option for the general configuration settings. And this customize option that you have is a profile type that will allow you to customize things that we can't automate when we import these settings. Things like the preferred AAD tenant domain name. While yes, it's easy for us to just query the graph and figure it out, the way that this tool works, we just can't import and then just automatically know that your preferred AAD tenant domain name is whatever your domain is. So what you need to do is you need to go and actually add inside of this configuration profile type, you'll need to go and configure the preferred AAD tenant domain name, some delivery optimization settings, OneDrive. There's some personalization settings here that will include desktop image and lock screen image URLs, as well as your time and language settings. And we'll go through and configure all of this right now. So what we'll do now is we'll go through and configure the general configuration settings customize policy. Now what you'll notice here is for assignments, this is set to not targeted to any groups right now. We'll come back to this in just a second once we've set our configuration settings, because we don't want to target anything until these customizations have been put in. So let's go through and click on Edit and then Authentication. And so here what we want to do is we want to add our preferred AAD tenant domain name. And so what I'm going to do is just add the DNS suffix of the domain name. So in this case here, this is the domain that we're using in this tenant. And now for delivery optimization, what this is leveraging something called Microsoft Connected Cache. And back in the documentation, we explain what connected cache is. And we highly recommend that you have connected cache set up in your environment. And you can do it one of two ways. The first way is to leverage the Microsoft Connected Cache standalone program that's in preview today. You can sign up here. There's a form that you can fill out that will that'll get you access within your tenant. You do need to have an Azure subscription in order for it to work. And as you go through the documentation, it'll explain the prerequisites in order for that to happen. But we also have the ability to do this through Configuration Manager distribution points. So if you have Configuration Manager today, you can enable connected cache on those distribution points, and you can do it through the steps that we have here. Once that's set up, what you need to do is you need to adjust the DO cache host field. The DO cache host option here, unfortunately, I couldn't create the policy without putting some level of text in here, and so I just included just some random local IP address. What you'll want to do though is once you have connected cache set up in your environment, you'll want to go and configure this with your connected cache host IP address or fully qualified domain name. And you can have multiple DO cache hosts. If you're a really large environment, you might have multiple DO cache hosts, and you can leverage multiple inside of this policy, or you can create separate policies if you want and target them to different groups of devices. Completely up to you on how you want to handle that. But we've also included some additional settings here as well. So DO delay cache server fallback. This is what will have us fall back in background to a different, to the Microsoft Cloud. So for instance, this option says 3600. What that means is that in 3600 seconds, we will fall back to the internet to download content if we can't find content on the cache host server that is in your environment. So when we are using connected cache, we're actually storing your Windows updates, your Microsoft Store apps, Intune apps, Office updates. And so if we can't find that content local within your environment, even though we're supposed to, because the DO cache service will tell us locally in your environment there is content there, go get that content from that server. But if that content doesn't exist on the server, it doesn't make sense to go to the server, wait 3600 seconds, and then go out to the internet. So we'll just go to the internet and then find that content and then send it over to the DO cache server. But if the DO cache server is having an issue where we can't reach it, some network related problem, then we'll wait the 3600 seconds, then go out to the internet. So this is the fallback time that it takes to go back to the internet and get the content that we need. But this is for background content. So background content would mean Windows updates that weren't checked for by a user from settings. So just your general background processing of Windows updates, background processing of Windows Store apps, and various other content that just happens in the background. Foreground, which is the next option, that delay is 60 seconds. So if a user is opening the Microsoft Store app and they're trying to install content from there, they might install a game, they could be installing a business app, whatever the case may be, we will wait 60 seconds before going out to the internet and getting that content. So if the DO service says the content is local, it's on your DO cache server, but we can't reach the server, we will wait 60 seconds just to see if we can eventually get it. If we can't, we'll then go out to the internet and grab the content. The next option is DO min file size to cache. We set this to 10. This is, in our experience, this is the smallest that you'll want to set this value. So the lowest you'll want to set it. If you try setting this to 1 or 0, which we've tested, it doesn't seem like the content behaves the way that you would expect it to. So 10 seems to be the best value, and this is what we would recommend. And then lastly here, DO min RAM allowed to peer. What this is doing is this is actually not controlling the DO cache server. What it's doing is it's controlling the clients within your environment and saying that you need 100,000 megabytes of RAM in order to peer content amongst each other. Now you might think that number is very high. It is very high. The reason it's very high is because what this is doing is it's turning off the ability for your clients to share content amongst each other. Now you might think, well, why would you want to do that? Well, because you're using the DO cache server, the server is going to be responsible for sending the content. we don't want our local clients, especially in K-12s, K-12 environments where you might have 30 devices in a classroom that share one access point. And if you have this in one school building, you could have dozens of classes in one building, and that content isn't just going to be shared in the classroom. It could be shared really across any device that's on the same NAT. And so that could mean we go across buildings, we go across from one classroom to the next classroom. Like, we don't know where that content is going to be retrieved from if you're using delivery optimization. So by putting this at some incredibly high value, it's going to make it so that the clients aren't sharing content amongst each other. Rather, what we're doing is we're saying, go to the server and get the content, instead of having just this mesh peer-to-peer situation where these clients are just getting content from whoever is responding back and saying, hey, I've got the content, I'm available. So we're preventing that from happening. So this is how we configure delivery optimization and the cache host values. So I'm going to leave this for my environment. I'm going to leave this as is. You'll want to change the DO cache host once you have Microsoft Connect Cache set up. The next option is OneDrive. So with OneDrive, keep everything as is, but for your tenant ID, you'll need to go get that. In order to get that, you can go to Entra. So just go to entra.microsoft.com. And then go to Overview and go to Tenant ID. So grab that, paste that right here. Now for personalization, what you'll want to do is use a URL for your desktop image and your lock screen. These could be two different things. For me, it's going to be the same thing. So I'm going to open up Notepad here, and I've got my URL. What you want to make sure to do is use a actual web server to host your image. Do not use a picture file sharing service. Don't try to use SharePoint. Don't use Box or Google Drive or OneDrive or any of those things. Try to use an actual web server. If you don't have one, or if you're the IT person but you don't deal with like your school website, go ask whoever is managing the website if there is a image of your school logo or whatever you want to use as the desktop wallpaper in the lock screen. Store it there. Do not store it in some cloud service, because those URLs, Windows doesn't understand those URLs, and it's not going to be able to show the desktop wallpaper as you would expect it to. Also, you want to make sure that you're using a JPEG or a PNG. You might be able to use a BMP. Not quite sure if BMP will work, but JPEGs and PNG files, I know those work. And then lastly, time and language settings. So to find your time and language, the easiest way to do that is to, at a command prompt, just type in tzutil/L, and this will give you the format that you need for time zone. Now, so for me, I'm in the Pacific time zone, so I'm going to use Pacific Standard Time. You will likely be in a different time zone, so pick the one that makes the most sense for your environment. I'm going to review and save this, and then we're going to deploy it. So let's go to Assignments, and then we will click on Add All Devices. Now, in your environment, you may not want to do this because you might have personal devices in the organization. If that's the case, you'll want to handle this a bit different. So for your devices, you have a couple of ways to handle this. You can either do all devices and then select Edit Filter. Now, you may not have filters set up. Like I mentioned earlier, we do import some filters for you. However, these aren't the filters that you would want to use for this situation. You should want to create filters that will filter devices to corporate devices that you want to manage. So it could be student devices, could be faculty devices, but you want to make sure that they're corporate devices and you're not affecting personal devices, at least with this configuration profile type. So go create a filter, and then if you are going to do that, click Include Filtered Devices in the assignment, and then select the filter that you just created. Don't just use these. These are not filtering out corporate devices. These are literally just grouping up your Windows 10 and Windows 11 devices. Alternative to this is that you can use a group. So if we remove this and we go to Add Groups, you can go and pick a group of devices that you have in your organization and deploy this policy to a group of devices. And then you could, on top of that, you could also leverage filters as well. but that is not the scope of what this video is about. So for demo purposes, we're going to be using all devices. Okay, so that's configured, so everything is good from our customizations. Now for everything else in here, we can target these to our all devices group, or whatever group that we're targeting for devices, and then for student, we can target to our student user group. There aren't any other customizations that you must do. However, a couple things to call out. So we have software updates for our software update rings. Now in this environment, I'm going to be using our shared cart scenario. So I'm going to be targeting to a shared type of environment. In your environment, you may not be dealing with shared carts or shared labs, and you just want to do one-to-one. If that's the case, don't target the shared cart stuff. Don't target any of this. Use the one-to-one update ring, and then everything else, aside from kiosk, should be applicable. So you would do one-to-one update ring, your general config settings, your customization of the general config settings, Intune data collection policy, removing news and interest, removing widgets. Let's actually talk about that now. So for remove news and interests for Windows 10, as I mentioned earlier, we have a filter that we import into your tenant. So when we add all devices here, what we want to make sure that we're doing is we're adding the filter for Windows 10 devices. Now when we do this, what this means is that we're targeting all devices, but we're segmenting this off to just the Windows 10 devices within the tenant. And so by doing this, we're actually removing news and interests for just your Windows 10 devices. And the reason we split this up is because if you don't split this up and you target remove news and interests and you target remove widgets to the same group that might have both Windows 10 and 11 devices, you'll start to get errors in your policy reporting that aren't going to make any sense. It's going to show that you've got a bunch of devices that have errors, which it's not that you have an error per se, like yes, it is erroring, but you can't remove news and interest on Windows 11 because news and interest doesn't exist. Just like you can't remove widgets on Windows 10 because widgets doesn't exist on Windows 10. So we segmented this out so you get better reporting that's more representative of what's going on in the environment. So we will review and save this for our Windows 10 devices, and then we'll do the same for remove widgets for Windows 11. Okay, so after doing that, we can now go through the rest of these and just start targeting to our device group that we're using, and then we can also do the student group. So let's go through, and we'll just go one by one here. All devices. We did customize Intune data collection policy. And if you're curious about what all of these policies are doing, we have a settings reference guide back in the documentation that explains every single setting that has been set within this upload. So there's over 100 settings in here. You'll have the ability to see exactly what we're doing, and as we make modifications, we do have plans to update the documentation so that way everyone's aware of what's being set. Alternatively, you could always just go through and click through and see exactly what's being set. You can modify things. There's nothing that is locking you to any of these settings. Okay, and skip ESP. Okay, so now we're at the student deny admin and student general restrictions. So to explain what these things are doing, the student deny admin apps is denying the ability for a user group, in this case it's going to be a student group. So if I add groups and select student, this will prevent my student users from being able to run command prompt, PowerShell, regedit, and the terminal app. So all of those things are being denied, and it's doing it through a app locker policy within an XML file. So if you're curious about what's inside of this, you can just do what I'm doing here and see what exactly is being restricted. And we do the same thing, but for terminal, we have to do it a slightly different way because terminal is it's a UWP app. It's not a EXE. So blocking this is done in a slightly different way, but it's still using app blocker. So those app blocker policies are what's responsible. Okay, so student is blocked from that. And then we want to block student from the general restrictions. And so these general restrictions are just preventing the student from doing a few different things. First, they can't add Microsoft accounts, they can't add accounts, just a non-Microsoft account or just a regular Microsoft account. They have no capability of doing that. We are turning off the store application, so it's blocked for the users that are in this group. We're also hiding the mechanisms to remove zone information. What this means is that when you download a file from the internet, let's say you're downloading an MSI file to install Discord or installing Chrome or some other application, when you right-click on that and go to Properties, there's an option in there that allows you to unblock. There's something called the mark of the web when you download a file in Windows. And sometimes it'll tell you, hey, you can't run this because of the security settings that are on your device. If you click on block, then you're able to run the app. What this is doing is it's preventing that unblock option from showing up. So they can't download a file like the setup executable for Discord or whatever and try to run it. They won't be able to do that. We are allowing updates from the Microsoft Store. We're blocking the ability to add and remove provisioning packages, and we are also requiring authentication for the Windows recovery environment. And then lastly, we enable install app control through Smart Screen. And between Smart Screen, blocking the store, and the remove zone information, this is basically pointing the student to having to install applications from the store, but because the store is blocked, they won't be able to install anything. And so this is a easier way of blocking students from installing apps without having to leverage something like Windows Defender Application Control, because it's a little bit more heavy-handed and a lot more difficult to manage. And so now we set all devices as, I'm sorry, that's wrong. We set our student group as the target. And we're done with our configuration profiles. So once you go through configuration profiles and you're complete there, we next need to move on to going to feature updates for Windows 10 and later. Now, feature updates for Windows 10 and later are how you can control which version of Windows is deployed to your entire organization. And so for school districts right now, February 2024, chances are you probably are deploying either Windows 11 or Windows 10, most likely Windows 10 22H2. And you may go to Windows 11 23H2 next school year. Why don't you go to 24H2 next school year? Because 24H2 is not going to come out until like October-ish, somewhere around there. And so it's going to come after the school year starts. So you're always going to be like a year behind in terms of what's in this list. So 23H2 is here, but you aren't going to be deploying it. So if you're doing 10 or 11, pick the one that you're deploying to all of your devices. You might be doing a mix, and so you might have to target a couple of these to different groups. In our case here, what we're going to do is we're going to target Windows 11 22H2, and we're just going to name this Windows 11 22H2. And we're going to keep all the other options the same here, and just click on Next. And then for groups, what's a little different here is that I can't do the all devices group like I could for everything else. I actually have to target a specific group of devices. And so in this case, I'm targeting this group tag equals carts because in my demo, I'm doing all cart devices right now. And so in this case, I've got 6 devices in that group, and this all looks good. So we turn that on. And now we're targeted to 22H2. Now, you might think, okay, well, what if I have some devices that are 23H2 and I'm targeting 22H2? Am I going to downgrade? The answer to that's no. You will not downgrade. You will just maintain whatever's on the device currently. And so if you want to upgrade everything to 23H2, then you would just come in and change this to 23H2. Probably do that during the summer. And it's important that we set this too. The reason it's important is because for the update rings that we import, when we go and look at the rings, there's an option here for feature update deferral period days of 0. If you do not target a feature update like we just did, what's going to happen is that when these are targeted to devices, and if you had a feature update deferral on a previous update ring and you're shifting to using these rings, this update period of 0 will start upgrading your devices to the next release of Windows 11. So it's important that you actually set a feature update like we did here. It's very important that you set that. Okay, so now that that's done, let's go take a look at apps. So within apps, we have imported 2 apps. We have removed Microsoft apps and we have Windows Update before initial logon allowed. Now, both of these used to be remediations. If you installed the first zip file that we had uploaded back at the end of 2023, we were using remediations, but remediations have a problem where they're indeterministic as to when they install. They don't always install during autopilot. They could happen, who knows when it's going to happen, but it's not going to be something that happens immediately, and you can't force them to install at a specific time during the rollout of a device. So what we've done instead is we've converted these to Win32 apps, and so now we can require these during autopilot, during the enrollment status page, to say, install these 2 required apps. You can have multiples as well. You can have additional applications, but we can say that these things must run. And so what are these doing? Well, the remove Microsoft apps is going to remove the built-in applications that come in Windows. And if you want to know what apps are included, we've documented that on the GitHub repo. But you can also just look in here and see that we're removing all these built-in apps here. And this is going to be a list that's always updated. As there's a new release of Windows, there's a new app that we include. There's always something new, like DevHome. That's relatively new. This thing here, this is Cortana. That's been around for a while, but most people don't know that that's actually the Cortana app. And then Outlook for Windows. That's the new Outlook client that we're deploying out that's going to everyone's devices. So as new applications come out, we need to add and update them to the list. And so we're going to try to keep up with that as best as we can. So that way everyone's got the latest apps being removed if they don't make sense for an education environment. So what we want to do, though, is we want to assign this to a group of devices. And so I'm going to do all devices. One thing you want to do as well is you want to make sure to set for end user notifications, set this to hide all toast notifications. This is because as new applications get added or as devices get upgraded, when you upgrade a device, sometimes these applications come back. So the Teams client could come back, Xbox app could come back. And what this script is going to do through a Win32 app is it's going to check for the presence of those apps, and if it sees those applications, we're then going to remove the apps. And what we don't want to have happen is the end user getting a toast notification every time this happens. So we block the toast notifications, and this will all happen behind the scenes, and the end user won't be aware. And so we've done that with that app. And then so this next app, this Windows Update before initial logon allowed, this is primarily for shared cart devices or devices that you will provision during the summer, or it could be in the winter, but they're going to sit for months. And so the scenario that I've dealt with in the past is a customer will provision devices in June, July, get them ready for August or September, and those devices will end up in a cart and be shipped to a school site. The school will plug those devices in. They'll plug the cart in a classroom, and it'll sit there. Now, these devices will be powered on through the cart, and they'll wake up every night. But what wouldn't happen is that they won't install updates. And so what we're doing with this app is there's a fix that we added in Windows 11 in the April cumulative update. And that fix is to set a registry value to allow Windows Update to run before the initial logon of the first user. And so what will happen in this scenario is the devices will wake up based on a wake timer that's generally set through shared PC, and the device wakes up, installs its updates, and then goes back to sleep. And so this will prevent students or first user that's signing into the device from being prompted for Windows updates and being behind. It's also a more secure way of doing things, because if the device is sitting in June and no one touches it till August or September, you've got a few months there where you're not installing updates, and you're vulnerable at that moment. So this application will fix that. And it's not really an app per se, it's just a PowerShell script. And so what we're going to do with this one is do the exact same thing as we did with the other app. The toast notifications aren't that big of a deal for this one, but I'm just going to keep things consistent, because this setting should never really change. It's not like an app that's going to come back after you do an in-place upgrade of Windows. Okay, so we've got our apps done. And so the next thing we want to do is we want to go to endpoint security. And within endpoint security, we have antivirus and disk encryption. So we'll complete these items, and then we'll be done with our configuration within Intune. Okay, so the next thing we want to do is under endpoint security antivirus, we want to go through and configure our Defender antivirus and our Windows Security Experience policy types. Now for Microsoft Defender antivirus, these are the settings that tamper protection will configure. Not all of them. Most of these are actually tamper protection. There are some that aren't tamper protection, but they're recommended settings that we want to apply. And so you might be thinking, okay, what is tamper protection? Tamper protection is a setting in Windows that prevents a user from tampering with the device. And this also includes admins. But tamper protection is something that is not available for customers that aren't using Microsoft Defender for Endpoint. So if you're not using Defender for Endpoint P2, and you don't have licenses for that, you can't use tamper protection. Now, the settings that tamper protection will set are the defaults in Defender. But the defaults in Defender can be modified by an end user if they use Windows Security Center. So by setting these settings, you will gray out in Security Center the ability for the end user to modify these settings. So while most of these are the defaults for Windows Defender, you will not have the ability as an end user to go and change these in Windows Security Center. That does not mean, though, that an attacker can't change these settings. Because if an attacker gets control of the device and they are admin, they'll have the capability of changing these settings. So this is a very long-winded way of basically saying that what we're doing is we're setting the default settings for Defender for the most part. Most of these are the default settings, not all of them. But these are the default, most of these are the default settings that we will set to prevent your end users from inadvertently or maybe advertently changing these settings within Windows Security Center. So it protects the end user, does not protect an attacker. Tamper protection will prevent, is supposed to prevent an attacker from being able to change these settings even as an admin. So that's the difference between the two. So if you're a customer that is not using Defender for Endpoint, you should set the Defender antivirus, you should deploy this setting. So we'll go through and do this deployment here. Now, if you are a customer of Defender for Endpoint and you have licenses for that, I still recommend that you target both of these. Target Defender for Antivirus because it doesn't only include tamper protection settings. There's some other settings in there as well. We document what those settings are in our GitHub repo. But you should set both of these if you are a Defender for Endpoint customer. If you're not a Defender for Endpoint customer, do not set this setting. You're going to get some errors. It's not the end of the world if you get the errors. You're not going to see them on the endpoint, but you'll see these errors in the Intune console. Now, what's really interesting is that this tamper protection option has a very different flow compared to any other deployment of a policy type. This is, I've never seen this experience before. It just landed in 2401 of Intune. So that is the deployment of tamper protection and of antivirus. And the last thing we want to do here is look at disk encryption. So disk encryption is BitLocker. And what we're going to do is just deploy this to our devices group. And what this will do is it'll configure BitLocker silently. End user won't see anything. The BitLocker recovery key will be stored in Entra ID and also in Intune. You'll see it on the Intune device object or the Entra ID device object. And the last thing we want to do is under devices, under enroll devices, there are a couple of autopilot profiles that we need to configure. So our autopilot profiles, we have a self-deploying autopilot profile and we have a user-driven autopilot profile. For this demo, I'm going to be using user-driven. However, for your physical devices, I strongly recommend that you look at self-deploy autopilot profiles. The reason for that is because self-deploy autopilot profiles are touchless, more or less. You don't have to sign in to the device during the autopilot flow. You just connect it to the network, and once it's connected to the network, whether it's through a Ethernet jack or through a Wi-Fi connectivity, you'll get the autopilot profile and it'll configure the device. You don't have to do anything special. With user-driven, you do have to sign into the device during the out-of-box experience, and so it's a little bit different. But the other difference between the two of these is that the self-deploy autopilot profile will not assign a primary user to the device. So if you're doing shared devices, self-deploy autopilot profiles are preferred over user-driven. If you're doing one-to-one devices, then you can use user-driven or self-deploy. Doesn't necessarily matter. There are some pros and cons to it. This is not the venue for going over the pros and cons of primary user. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to configure this user-driven profile. So in here, what you want to customize, and the reason why we say customize is the device name template. So come into here, I'm going to call this cart %serial. And then I need to assign this to a group, and this is going to go to my cart group. And I'm using an autopilot group tag of cart, and I've already uploaded my device to the environment. And you'll want to do, just go back here, you'll want to do this for self-deploy as well. If you're going to be using self-deploy autopilot profiles, you might use a mix of both in your environment. And so come in here and give this the prefix that you want. Now I'm not going to assign this to the same group, but that's what you would want to configure. Those are the only things you need to customize for autopilot profiles. And then lastly, the enrollment status page. So we provide you a enrollment status page. I've got a few of them here. You'll only get one. I've got a few here because I've uploaded a couple of these, so I'm just going to delete 2 of these. But when you look at this in your environment, you'll notice that these settings these are the defaults for the most part. But one thing that I want to call out here is for the blocking of devices. So there's this block device use until required apps are installed if they're assigned to the user or device. This can take a while for autopilot to process if you're targeting a bunch of apps to your machines. And if you have 10 apps that are deployed, we have to wait for every single one of those apps to be installed. If you don't care about all of the different apps that are targeted in your environment, come in here and select selected, and then select the applications that you want required. What I like to do is, depending on the environment that I'm working in, we might create an image that has a bunch of apps that we want already. And if that's the case, I don't need a bunch of applications to be deployed. What I really need, though, is I need the enrollment status page to complete and to show whoever's doing the imaging that things are working, and that once it gets through the enrollment status page and we're at the logon screen, we know we're complete. So I need the enrollment status page to govern the enrollment process, but I don't necessarily need to wait for a bunch of applications to install, because I could be doing thousands of devices and I don't have time to wait for Office and Chrome and Firefox and Teams and whatever else I might be deploying. I need to wait for all that stuff. So what I would want to do, though, is maybe I'm not removing the apps in my image. If that's the case, I can select this remove Microsoft apps, or I can select both of these. I can select remove the apps, and I can select the Windows Update before initial logon. These apps don't take a long time to run. There's no content. All these things are doing is they're running just a script that's going to remove something or add a registry value. So the removal of Microsoft apps, that'll take some time because there's a lot of apps that we have to go through and process and get rid of. But the Windows Update before initial logon, that doesn't take a lot of time at all. It's just a registry value. So I can deploy both of these or one of these, and this will keep it so that I don't have to wait for everything in the environment to process. I can just wait for these two things. And then if my image has all my apps in it already, then I'm good to go. But if I do need to install things from Intune, like maybe I do need to install Office or I need to install something else, then you might want to select those apps as well. So this is completely up to you. But we do recommend that you come into here and figure out what makes sense for your environment for the applications that you want to block with. And so we're going to review this and save it. And then I'm going to assign this to my cart group. Okay, so now we're done, and let's go take a look at a device. So over here, we have our device that's ready to go through autopilot, and so let's do that. So we're gonna hit yes, just to get through the first few screens here of the out-of-box experience. Okay, let's sign in with our student account, which is just going to be a standard user account. And let's sign in with our password. So now we'll do the device setup, and we'll eventually get into the enrollment status page once this completes. So now that we're at the enrollment status page, we'll see that we've secured our hardware, we've joined our network, we have registered our device for mobile management, so we're in Intune. Now what we're doing here, and this preparing your device for mobile management step, is we're installing the Intune management extension. And so that'll take some time to install. There's an MSI file that downloads from Intune, and the device has to install that. And so once that completes, then we'll be moving on to the device setup phase. So now we're at the device setup phase, and we'll see that we have our security policies that are applied. There's no cert, there aren't any network connections, but we have 0 of 2 apps installed. So these are the 2 apps that we selected as blocking in the enrollment status page, and so we're going to wait for those applications to install. And as I mentioned, the Microsoft app removal will take some time to process. The registry value for the Windows updates installing before initial sign-in, that should not take as long. So we've completed app 1 of 2. And now we've completed app 2 of 2, and we're now completing the reboot. And so the enrollment status page should be complete. And we've skipped the account setup phase and the profiles that we had imported. So now we're at the logon screen. And so you can see we've got our custom wallpaper that we specified in our customizations. And now we can sign into the device. So we'll sign in as student, and we will type in our password. And so now we'll go through the student first run experience, and this experience is being handled by shared PC, so you don't see the normal first run experience. You just see this preparing Windows because shared PC is doing stuff a little bit differently than the normal sign-in process, and this can take about 90 seconds to a couple minutes for the initial sign-on to take place. Okay, so we're signed into the device, and now we're ready to validate that everything has come down successfully from Intune. And so in the first logon experience, things can tend to take a little bit for things like OneDrive to process, but as the OneDrive client updates, because in Inbox it's going to be out of date, so the client goes out to the internet, it updates itself, so that's going to take a little bit of time for that to happen. And then we'll also see Edge will update as well, but Edge is also going to be pre-configured based on the settings that we have in Intune. So if we go into File Explorer now, it looks like OneDrive has been updated and the files are up to date. What you'll notice though in this config is that on the shared PC config, I don't have the ability to actually see my files and folders, because in shared PC I'm actually blocking students from being able to see these things. However, if you're not using shared PC and you come into here, you'll be able to see that OneDrive has been pre-configured. If you go look at your OneDrive folder, you'll see that it's there. You'll see that the content is available to you if you need it. But in the OneDrive client app, you'll see that I've got a file here that's up in Contoso. It's got a great file name. And if I click into this, it'll show that I can't actually get to OneDrive because it's blocked through File Explorer because it's been restricted. That doesn't mean you can't actually use OneDrive. You can still use it through Word and various other means through like the internet and the web. So what you notice here is in Edge, Edge has been pre-configured. So Edge works just fine. I'm signed in. My profile has already been configured for me. I'm not getting the first run experience. And so I'm going to office.com and it's all single sign-on. Everything looks great. There's no issues here. But what I can also do though is I can attempt to download something as a student. So let me go to Discord. Seems like students and kids like using Discord these days. And so when we go to Discord, we can go download Discord for Windows. And this will be in our downloads folder, which you will have access to as a student. Now if I double click this, what we'll notice is that I'm going to get blocked from being able to use this. Now, unfortunately, in Windows 11.23 H2, there is a bug with how we show this. This shouldn't be as big as it is. The sizing is wrong. The formatting of this window is wrong. But what this basically is telling us is that this app you're trying to install isn't a Microsoft verified app. Installing apps for the store helps protect your PC, so go to the store and get the app. So I can click this button that says Get Apps from the Store, and it's going to kick off the Microsoft Store application. At least it's supposed to kick off the store application, but I think this window is bugged in the latest release of Windows 11 23H2. If you're using 22H2, this should work. Windows 10, this should work fine. I think there's just something up with this window here in the latest releases of 23H2 that needs to be resolved. But what you should see, though, is that if you try to go to the store application will open, and it should, after a moment, because it knows that the policy that's been assigned to you is blocking the store, it'll come up with this message here saying the store is blocked. Check with your IT or system administrator. I'm going to try this one more time, see if this gets handled. Yeah, it's still not popping up, but you should go directly to the store and it should get you. So there's something up with this window with 23H2, but 22H2, Windows 10, 22H2, Windows 11, 22H2, or earlier releases, you shouldn't have that problem. And so we can go and download any other executables. You'll have the same situation where, or even if you try to download MSI files, you try to download Chrome, you'll see the same thing, that Chrome is also going to be blocked. In fact, I'll try to download that now. This is something pretty common, that a browser gets installed or downloaded and users are able to install third-party browsers that aren't managed by the organization. And so if we go to our Chrome setup folder, try to run this, you get the same experience. The difference between this file and the other file, well, Microsoft will tell you have to use Edge, but the same problem here exists, though, is that you can't install what you're downloading. And so Chrome would typically install in your local user profile. But in this case, you can't do that either. And so when we look at this file, both of these are executables. If one was an MSI file, you'd have the same kind of situation as well. But what you'll notice is that you can't use the unblock option here to circumvent this. So we've completely prevented the student from installing something from the internet. And if we did the same thing with Firefox, you have the same exact situation. So we're going to try to download Firefox, and the Firefox installer will also be blocked. And you won't be able to do that because, again, the bug with this window. But you see that you can't install anything as a student user. All that stuff's blocked. And so there are a variety of other settings that are in here. I'm not going to go through every single one of them. You can look through those in the documentation. But hope this helps. And if you have any questions or if there's any issues, feel free to open up an issue in the GitHub repo. We'll take a look at it. We'll work with you and see if we can get that resolved. Thanks a lot.